Black CEO dragged from VIP seat. Minutes later, he fired the crew as it went viral. Hello everyone, before we begin today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel is losing traction and subscribing is one of the best ways you can help us. It's quick, free, and allows us to continue bringing you great content. Your support means everything. Let's keep this channel growing collectively. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to the story. Sir, you need to get up. That seat isn't yours. The words didn't come out politely. They cracked across the first-class cabin like a whip. Every head within 3 rows turned. The plane hadn't even pushed back from the gate yet.
Soft jazz floated through the overhead speakers.
Champagne glasses clinked lightly. Designer carry-ons rested neatly in overhead bins. It was the kind of polished, calm money buys. And in seat 1, by the window, sat a black man in a fitted charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and clean white sneakers. No Rolex. No suit. No entourage. Just stillness. The flight attendant, mid-30s, tight smile stretched thin, stood in the aisle with one hand gripping the armrest of his seat like she already owned it. I said, she repeated louder, "This is a VIP cabin." A few passengers exchanged looks. A man in a navy blazer smirked. A woman across the aisle leaned closer, pretending not to stare while staring anyway. The man in 1A didn't flinch. His name was Malcolm Reed, 42, founder, majority stakeholder, billion-dollar portfolio spanning tech logistics and private aviation contracts. But in that moment to them, he was just a man in a hoodie who looked out of place. He slowly lifted his boarding pass between 2 fingers. "Seat 1A, he said calmly. "That's what it says." She didn't take it. Instead, she gestured toward the back of the plane. Economy is through that curtain. The air shifted. Not loud. Not chaotic. Just charged. Malcolm leaned back slightly, eyes steady. "I'm not moving." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change. And we're glad you're here. Now back to Malcolm. The flight attendant's smile disappeared.
Sir, don't make this difficult.
Behind her, another crew member whispered something. A third pulled out a tablet, tapping rapidly. One glance at Malcolm, another at the manifest. A man across the aisle muttered under his breath. They really trying this. Malcolm had seen this look before. At 23, when a venture capitalist told him he didn't fit the culture. At 29, when security followed him through his own supplier's warehouse. At 35, when a hotel receptionist asked if he was waiting for someone. It was never about proof. It was about perception. The attendant reached down suddenly and tugged at the edge of his seatbelt. Gasps.
Sir, I need you to stand up.
Her fingers brushed his shoulder. That was the breaking of invisible glass. Malcolm looked up slowly. Not angry. Not loud. Just present. "Take your hand off me." The tone wasn't aggressive. It was final. A man 2 rows back lifted his phone. The red recording light blinked on.
Across the aisle, a young flight trainee froze, eyes flicking between the manifest and Malcolm's face.
"This isn't necessary," she murmured softly. But it was already escalating. The attendant straightened. "You people always try this," she snapped before she could stop herself. Silence detonated. The words hung there ugly and undeniable. Malcolm didn't react outwardly, but something shifted behind his eyes. He reached into his pocket, not hurried, not defensive, and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up. One name pinned at the top. Board chair. He didn't dial yet. He just let the weight of the moment breathe. Because the problem wasn't that they didn't know who he was. The problem was how they treated who they thought he wasn't. And in less than a few minutes, this cabin, this crew, this airline would understand exactly who was sitting in seat 1A. The cabin hadn't always been tense. 20 minutes earlier, it had been effortless. Malcolm Reed had walked down the jet bridge alone. No assistant trailing behind him. No rolling security detail. Just a slim leather duffel slung over one shoulder and that same unbothered calm in his stride. Gate agents barely looked up when they scanned his boarding pass. Green light. Soft beep. "Have a good flight, sir." He nodded once and kept moving. He preferred it that way. No headlines. No Mr. Reed over here. No staged airport photos. Power, he had learned, was loudest when it didn't need to introduce itself. The first-class cabin had smelled like citrus polish and fresh linen. Wide seats. Muted gold trim. A curated silence reserved for people accustomed to being obeyed. Seat 1A had been waiting by the window. He placed his duffel in the overhead bin without struggle. Sat down. Buckled in. Closed his eyes for just a moment. Not to sleep. To observe? Because Malcolm hadn't booked this flight for convenience. He had booked it for clarity. For 3 months, complaints had been trickling in quiet at first. Emails forwarded from customer experience teams. Anonymous posts online. Subtle allegations about selective enforcement in premium cabins. Nothing overt. Nothing that would survive legal scrutiny. But patterns don't lie. And Malcolm built his empire on recognizing patterns before they became lawsuits. So he dressed down. No tailored jacket. No cufflinks. No visible signals of wealth. Just a hoodie and patience. He wanted to see what happened when the armor of perception was removed. Across the aisle earlier, a middle-aged couple had boarded. Designer luggage. Luxury watch flashing beneath cabin lights. The lead attendant greeted them by name. "Mr. and Mrs. Halpern, welcome back." Champagne offered before they even sat. Malcolm had watched quietly. No greeting by name for him. No pre-departure drink. Just a glance. A calculation. A pause that lasted half a second too long. He recognized that pause. It was the mental inventory people take when they're deciding whether someone belongs. The trainee flight attendant, the youngest on the crew, had been the only one who smiled at him without hesitation. "Can I get you anything, sir?" she'd asked softly. "Water's fine," he'd replied. No assumptions. No suspicion. Just service. It told him everything he needed to know. Bias isn't instinct. It's taught. Now, back in the present, as the senior attendant stood in the aisle, challenging his seat, Malcolm understood something else. This wasn't a mistake. This was a test he hadn't announced. And they were answering it in real time. His phone rested loosely in his palm, now screen dark but ready. Not to threaten. Not to intimidate. But to document. Because if the pattern was real, if what he suspected was true, then this cabin wasn't just about to remove a passenger. It was about to expose a culture. And Malcolm Reed had never been interested in small corrections. He believed in structural ones. The engines outside began to hum softly as ground crew finished preparations. Inside the cabin, however, the real turbulence was just beginning. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step out of the seat." The tone had shifted. It wasn't customer service anymore. It was authority rehearsing itself. Malcolm remained seated, hands resting lightly on the armrests, posture straight but relaxed. The engines outside grew louder, a low mechanical hum building beneath the cabin floor. Inside, the air tightened. "I have a confirmed ticket," he said evenly. "You scanned it at the gate." The senior attendant crossed her arms. "We've had system discrepancies before." Discrepancies. Not mistake. Not misunderstanding. Discrepancies. Behind her, the other crew member scrolled rapidly through the seating manifest on a tablet. The glow from the screen reflected against her cheek. "I don't see a Malcolm Reed assigned to 1A, she announced. A ripple passed through the first-class cabin. The man in the navy blazer leaned forward slightly. "Told you," he muttered to his wife. Malcolm didn't look at them. Instead, he turned his phone face up on his lap and unlocked it calmly. "Would you like to see my digital boarding pass?" he asked. The attendant's jaw tightened. "That won't be necessary." But it was necessary, and everyone knew it. The trainee Maya shifted her weight near the galley entrance. Her eyes flicked to the tablet. I saw his name earlier," she said hesitantly.
Seat 1 showed confirmed when we boarded.
Silence. The senior attendant shot her a warning look sharp enough to cut. "Maya, please step back." The correction wasn't loud. It was controlled, which made it worse. Malcolm registered that exchange without turning his head. This wasn't about data. It was about narrative, and narratives harden quickly in confined spaces. A passenger 2 rows back lifted his phone higher, now openly recording. The tiny red light blinked like a witness. "You can't just move him without proof," someone said from across the aisle. The attendant ignored it. "Sir, we have VIP clients who require that seat configuration." "VIP clients." Malcolm almost smiled. He glanced toward the Halperns. They avoided eye contact. "So, this is about preference," he said quietly. "Not policy." "It's about maintaining standards," she snapped. There it was. Standards. A word that had escorted men like him out of rooms long before anyone admitted why. The captain's voice crackled faintly over the intercom from the cockpit, announcing a slight delay in departure due to a seating matter. Now it was official. Malcolm Reed had become a matter. 2 uniformed ground security officers appeared at the aircraft door, alerted before the situation had even reached clarity. That escalation wasn't accidental. The senior attendant stepped aside just enough to let Malcolm see them. "Sir," she said, "now stripped of courtesy, if you don't comply, you will be escorted off this aircraft." A quiet gasp moved through the cabin. Maya swallowed hard. "He hasn't done anything," she whispered. The attendant didn't answer her. She focused only on Malcolm, waiting for resistance, for anger, for something she could justify. Malcolm looked at the security officers, then back at her, still seated, still composed. He lifted his phone and tapped once. A call began to ring. Not to argue, not to threaten, but to ensure that whatever happened next would not disappear inside the sky. The phone rang once, twice. The senior attendant folded her arms, unimpressed. "Calling your lawyer won't change FAA protocol." Malcolm didn't respond to her. On the 3rd ring, the line connected. "Reed." The voice on the other end was crisp, alert, not surprised. "It's happening," Malcolm said quietly. Across the aisle, the man recording zoomed in slightly. "What's happening?" the voice asked. "See," one of Malcolm replied. "Escalation without verification."
Security at the door.
A brief pause. "Understood," the voice said. "Do you want this logged every word?" The call didn't end. It just stayed open. The senior attendant exhaled sharply. "Sir, this is your final warning." Behind her, one of the ground security officers stepped forward into clearer view. Not aggressive. Not yet dead, but present. The optics were forming. Maya's hands trembled slightly as she held the cabin tablet. She glanced down again at the seating chart, and there it was. A blank space where a name should have been. Her brow furrowed. "Wait," she murmured. She scrolled up, then down. Her pulse quickened. 10 minutes ago, she had watched the manifest update after boarding.
She had seen one a marked Reed, Malcolm confirmed.
Now it was empty. Not reassigned. Not modified. Empty. That wasn't a discrepancy. That was an edit. Maya, the senior attendant, warned again, voice low. But something had already shifted. Because doubt once introduced spreads faster than authority. Maya stepped forward despite the warning. Ma'am, she said, carefully addressing her supervisor the seat was assigned earlier. I saw it. The cabin went still. The Halperns looked up sharply. The man recording lowered his phone, slightly listening. The senior attendant's smile returned, but it wasn't warm. You're new, she said softly.
System glitches happen.
Maya swallowed. It didn't look like a glitch. That landed. Malcolm finally looked at her. Not grateful. Not surprised. Just steady. He recognized courage when he saw it. The security officers shifted their stance near the door, waiting for instruction. The senior attendant turned back to Malcolm. Sir, we are not debating this in front of other passengers. You already are, Malcolm replied. Across the aisle, a woman with silver hair spoke up for the first time. He hasn't raised his voice, she said firmly. Why are you treating him like a threat? The question hung heavy. Because that was the word floating unspoken in the cabin. Threat. The senior attendant straightened. This passenger is refusing crew instructions. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. I'm asking for verification, he said calmly. That's not refusal. That's procedure. Procedure. Another word that sounded different depending on who was using it. Maya took one more breath and turned the tablet outward just enough for the nearest passengers to see. There's no reassignment log, she said quietly. If a seat changes, there's supposed to be a timestamp. There wasn't one. A murmur rippled through first class. Now it wasn't just a confrontation. It was a question. And questions erode control faster than anger ever could. The senior attendant's composure thinned. Step back, Maya. But Maya didn't move. Not this time. Because what she had seen wasn't confusion. It was removal. And for the first time since the confrontation began, Malcolm Reed wasn't the only one no longer willing to stay silent. The cabin no longer felt like a luxury space. It felt like a courtroom at 30,000 feet. Maya's words lingered in the air. No reassignment log. The senior attendant's composure tightened like pulled wire. That's enough, she said sharply. Maya stepped away from the passenger. Passenger. Not sir. Not Mr. Reed. Just a category. Malcolm watched the shift carefully. This was the moment systems reveal themselves not in chaos, but in correction. The security officers took 2 measured steps down the aisle. Not rushing. Not touching. But close enough to imply outcome. Sir, one of them said evenly, we've been asked to escort you off the aircraft due to non-compliance. Non-compliance. The word slid into place like it had been waiting. Malcolm looked up at him. I've complied with every request except surrendering a seat that's mine. The officer hesitated just slightly. Behind him, passengers were no longer pretending not to watch. Phones were up. Whispers were no longer whispers. Across the aisle, the silver-haired woman spoke again. This is wrong. And then the senior attendant reached forward. Not violently. Not dramatically. But enough to place her hand firmly on the edge of Malcolm's shoulder. Stand up. Now. There it was. The line crossed. The cabin went silent in a way that felt physical. Malcolm didn't react immediately. He didn't swat her hand away. He didn't raise his voice. But something in his posture changed. Stillness turned into weight. Remove your hand, he said quietly. The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. At 16, Malcolm had stood in a department store in Chicago while a clerk followed him aisle to aisle. At 24, security asked him to leave a tech conference he had paid to attend because badges get misplaced. At 31, a hotel manager demanded a second ID for a room booked under his own company's corporate account. Each time he had explained. Each time he had proven himself. Each time the burden had been his. He had promised himself something back then. The next time it happened, he wouldn't argue. He would document and dismantle. The attendant didn't remove her hand. Instead, she leaned closer. You're causing a scene.
Malcolm let out a slow breath.
No, he said. You are. The security officer stepped in again, tension visible now. Sir, if you don't stand, we will have to assist you. Assist. Another word that sounded different in context. Malcolm finally rose,
Not because they ordered him to.
but because he chose the moment. He stood to full height, taller than most expected. Calm. Unshaken. The cabin felt smaller around him. His phone was still connected, still listening. He looked at the senior attendant directly now. You've escalated this without verification. You've altered a manifest without record. And you've placed hands on a confirmed passenger. A pause. Measured. Controlled. Are you sure you want to continue? The question wasn't defensive. It was final. And for the first time since this began, the certainty in her eyes flickered. He didn't wait for her answer. Malcolm lowered his gaze slightly, not in submission, but in calculation, and tapped his screen once. Activate review protocol, he said into the phone. Calm. Precise. On the other end, the response came instantly. Recording is live. Legal and operations are patched in. The senior attendant frowned. Sir, you are not authorized to record crew. I don't need authorization to document my own removal, Malcolm replied evenly. The security officers exchanged a glance. This wasn't the usual script. Usually there was shouting, defiance, a raised voice they could point to. Instead, there was structure. Across the aisle, the man filming cleared his throat. It's already streaming, he said. Just so everyone's aware. The words landed harder than any accusation.
Streaming.
The senior attendant's eyes flicked toward the phones in the cabin. There were more of them now. More lenses. More witnesses. Malcolm continued, voice still measured. Timestamp this, he said into the call. Pre-departure? Gate 19. First class cabin. Attempted removal without manifest confirmation. Logged, the voice replied. He took one slow breath. Also note physical contact initiated by crew. The senior attendant pulled her hand back instantly as if burned. That's not what happened, she snapped. Maya stepped forward again before she could stop herself. It is, she said quietly. You touched him first. The air shifted. Not explosive, but decisive. The security officer closest to Malcolm adjusted his stance. Ma'am, he said carefully to the attendant, was the manifest rechecked with dispatch. The question was subtle, but it cracked the authority in half. The attendant hesitated just long enough for doubt to become visible. We don't need dispatch for this, she insisted. Malcolm tilted his head slightly. Then who authorized the seat removal? Silence. Because removal requires record, and record requires accountability. His phone buzzed softly in his palm. A second voice joined the call, deeper, older. We're monitoring, it said. Continue. The senior attendant's composure thinned further. This is disruptive behavior, she tried again. We cannot delay departure over what Malcolm asked. Not louder. Just sharper. Over-verifying your own system, a few passengers nodded openly now. The silver-haired woman folded her arms. We're not taking off until this is clear, she said. And suddenly the leverage wasn't in uniform. It was invisibility. Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He didn't reveal who he was. Not yet. He simply shifted the battlefield. From control to process. From intimidation to documentation. He stepped slightly aside, not toward the aisle, but toward the open space near the galley, inviting transparency. If you're confident in your decision, he said calmly, call dispatch. Confirm the log. Let's do it properly. A pause. Engines humming. Phones recording. Crew watching. Passengers waiting. This was no longer about a seat. It was about whether power could survive scrutiny. And Malcolm Reed had just turned the spotlight on, without raising his voice, without revealing his title, without leaving seat 1A behind. The senior attendant reached for her tablet again, but this time her hands weren't steady. The tablet screen reflected in her eyes. Scroll. Refresh. Scroll again. Nothing. No reassignment log. No override authorization. No dispatch note. Just an empty space where a name had been. The engines continued their low, patient hum outside, but inside the cabin, everything felt suspended. Call dispatch, the security officer repeated quietly. The senior attendant hesitated, then tapped the intercom to the cockpit instead. We need confirmation on seat 1A, she said, trying to steady her voice. A pause.
Static.
Then the captain's voice returned, controlled but strained. Dispatch shows one confirmed to Malcolm Reed.
Ticket paid in full.
No changes.
Silence detonated.
Every phone in the cabin tilted slightly higher. The man in the navy blazer sank back into his seat. Maya closed her eyes briefly. The senior attendant's fingers tightened around the tablet. That's not possible, she whispered. Malcolm finally stepped forward fully into the aisle, not aggressive, not triumphant. Present. Is, he said calmly. The captain continued over the speaker. Additionally, Operations is requesting immediate clarification as to why removal protocol was initiated. The word protocol echoed. Malcolm lifted his phone slightly. You asked who authorized verification, he said evenly. Now you know. The senior attendant looked at him differently now. Not as a passenger. Not as a problem. As a variable, she had miscalculated. He held her gaze. You tried to remove me from a seat that was confirmed, he said, voice steady enough to carry through the entire cabin. You escalated to security without verification. A breath. You placed hands on a paying passenger. Another beat. And you did all of that because you assumed I didn't belong. No one interrupted him. Not the captain. Not security. Not the Halperns. Then he delivered it. The sentence that would travel further than this aircraft ever could. You call this VIP cabin, Malcolm said quietly. You just forgot I helped decide who flies in it? The words landed heavy. Maya's eyes widened. The security officer stepped back slightly. The captain's voice returned sharper now. Mr. Reed, is this Malcolm Reed of Reed Aviation Holdings? Malcolm didn't smile. Yes. Another pause. Longer, this time.
Sir, the captain said carefully, you are listed as a principal investor and board member.
There it was. Not shouted. Not dramatic. Just confirmed. The cabin shifted in real time. Phones steadied. Passengers straightened. The senior attendant's authority drained from her posture like air from a punctured cabin. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply said the sentence that ended the debate. You attempted to remove me from an airline I partially own. And the weight of that truth pressed against every surface in the room. The word own did something to the room. It didn't explode. It deflated. Authority, once loud and upright, bent under the weight of confirmation. The senior attendant's tablet buzzed in her hand, then buzzed again. An incoming operations call. She didn't answer at first. She just stood there, eyes locked on Malcolm as if the right explanation might still surface. It didn't. Ma'am, the security officer said, carefully stepping back now instead of forward. We're going to need direction from operations. That shift was subtle, but everyone felt it. 5 minutes ago, they were prepared to escort him off. Now they were waiting for instructions. The captain's voice returned over the cabin speaker. Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We are resolving an internal matter prior to departure. Internal. Not passenger disturbance. Not non-compliance. Internal. The senior attendant finally answered the call. Yes, she said tightly.
Silence as she listened.
Her face changed. Color drained first, then posture. Her shoulders lowered not in relaxation but in realization. I understand, she replied quietly.
She ended the call.
The cabin waited. Malcolm remained standing calm as ever, phone still open, witnesses still recording.
She cleared her throat.
Mr. Reed, she began, the title returning with sudden urgency. There appears to have been a miscommunication. A murmur of disbelief moved through first class. Malcolm didn't blink. A miscommunication? He repeated. Yes, she insisted, though her voice had lost its edge. Operations has requested that we proceed with departure. Your seat assignment stands. Stands. It had always stood. The security officers stepped fully back toward the aircraft door, posture neutral now. Maya exhaled for the first time in minutes. But it wasn't over. Because collapse isn't just about reversal. It's about consequence. Malcolm's phone buzzed again. A text this time. Operations crew conduct review initiated. Remain on board. Do not deplane. He looked at the senior attendant steadily. You initiated removal protocol, he said calmly, without verification, on a confirmed passenger. She swallowed. Yes, Cess. You involved ground security. Yes, Cess. You placed hands on me. A beat. D. Yes, yes. Every admission echoed louder than accusation.
Another notification lit his screen.
Emergency board call scheduled. Pre-departure. The senior attendant's tablet buzzed again. Her access badge, clipped neatly to her uniform, let out a soft electronic tone.
She glanced down.
The light had turned red. Not fully disabled, but restricted. Cabin management privileges suspended pending review. The smallest sound in the world, yet it rang like a verdict. Passengers noticed. Phones caught it. Maya noticed too. Malcolm didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply stepped back into seat 1A and fastened his seatbelt. Calm, unmoved, because he hadn't raised his voice. He had raised the standard, and the system had just begun correcting itself in real time. The cabin doors remained open. Departure delayed. Not because of weather. Not because of maintenance. But because accountability had entered first class. Malcolm sat back in seat, one posture relaxed again as if nothing unusual had happened. But everything had. The senior attendant stood near the galley, now no longer commanding the aisle. Her tablet had been taken by another crew member. A quiet exchange. Averted eyes. The captain stepped out of the cockpit. That alone told the story. Captains do not leave their post for minor misunderstandings. He walked down the aisle, slowly measured, aware that every phone in the cabin was still recording.
He stopped in front of Malcolm.
Mr. Reed, he said carefully on behalf of the airline, I apologize for the handling of this situation. Not if there was mishandling. For the handling, precision matters. Malcolm met his eyes. I appreciate that, he replied calmly. But this isn't about me. The captain hesitated. Malcolm continued, It's about what would have happened if I wasn't who I am. Silence again. Because everyone in that cabin knew the answer. The security officers had already stepped off the aircraft. The senior attendant remained still, her earlier certainty nowhere to be found. Malcolm unbuckled his seatbelt slowly and stood one more time, not to challenge, not to confront, but to conclude. He turned slightly, just enough for the cabin to hear him clearly. I didn't object when you questioned my seat, he said evenly. I objected when you stopped verifying and started assuming. A passenger near the aisle nodded. Malcolm's voice never rose. You escalated before you confirmed. You acted before you checked. And you touched before you listened. Each sentence landed with surgical clarity. He glanced toward Maya. Not everyone in this cabin made that choice. Maya's eyes lowered, but her spine straightened. Then Malcolm delivered the line that would echo far beyond this flight. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was, he said quietly. It's how you treated who you thought I wasn't. No applause. No theatrics. Just a stillness that felt different now. He returned to his seat and fastened his belt again. The captain nodded once and turned back toward the cockpit. Cabin door closed. Engines roared to life. But something fundamental had shifted before takeoff. This wasn't a victory for a powerful man. It was a warning to a system. Because dignity doesn't need a title. It doesn't need a portfolio. It doesn't need partial ownership of the airline. It simply needs to be recognized. And Malcolm Reed hadn't raised his voice. He had raised the standard. The aircraft began to move. Not just toward the runway, but toward a different kind of accountability. The aircraft lifted off 23 minutes late, not announced as controversy. Not explained as correction. Just listed as a minor delay in the departure log. But inside that cabin, everyone knew something larger had happened. The climb was smooth. Seatbelt signs dimmed. Service resumed. Different hands now. The senior attendant had been quietly reassigned to the rear cabin pending further review. Another lead stepped forward, measured, composed, cautious. "Mister," Reed, the new attendant, said softly, offering a tray. "Would you care for something to drink? No edge? No calculation. Just professionalism." "Sparkling water," Malcolm replied. Across the aisle, conversations restarted, but in lower tones. The earlier certainty from certain passengers had dissolved into silence. The man in the navy blazer avoided eye contact entirely now. The silver-haired woman leaned slightly toward Malcolm. "You handled that with grace?" she said. He nodded, once. "Grace is cheaper than lawsuits," he answered quietly.
She smiled at that. Halfway through the ascent, Malcolm's phone buzzed again, this time with messages stacking quickly.
Board chat active. Operations audit initiated. PR monitoring, social media spike. The man who had been recording leaned across the aisle. "It's already trending," he said. Someone caught the dispatch confirmation. Malcolm didn't ask how many views. He didn't need to. Visibility changes behavior. Not instantly, but permanently. Another message lit up his screen: emergency executive review scheduled upon landing. Crew access temporarily limited. Not termination. Not yet. But accountability had entered the system. He glanced toward the rear cabin where the senior attendant now worked silently under supervision. Her movements were precise. Controlled. Different. Power doesn't disappear overnight. It gets examined. Maya passed by with a tray of refilled glasses.
She paused briefly beside him.
"I'm sorry," she whispered. Malcolm shook his head gently. "You did your job." A small nod from her. A quiet breath. He leaned back into the wide leather seat and stared out the window at the horizon cutting through the clouds. 20 years ago, he would have argued. 10 years ago, he might have threatened. Today, he documented. And documentation changes institutions. Because this wasn't about humiliation. It wasn't about revenge. It was about calibration. An airline that markets prestige cannot afford selective dignity. As the aircraft leveled at cruising altitude, a final message arrived: board vote initiated. Interim suspension recommended. Malcolm locked his phone and set it face down on the tray table. He hadn't fired anyone. He hadn't shouted. He hadn't exposed himself publicly until necessary. He had simply allowed the system to confront itself. And somewhere behind the cockpit door, policies were already being rewritten. Cruising altitude. 37,000 feet above ground. But the real pressure wasn't outside the aircraft. It was inside the corporate channel, lighting up Malcolm's phone. He let it sit for a moment before unlocking it. A live transcript from the emergency board session scrolled across the screen. Board member 1 was removal protocol, justified operations, no documentation supports escalation. Legal potential liability exposure confirmed. PR clip circulating across multiple platforms. Engagement rising. Malcolm read without emotion. Not satisfaction. Not anger. Just assessment. The same way he reviewed quarterly losses. The same way he reviewed safety audits. Patterns. Risk. Correction. Another line appeared: vote in progress. Across the aisle, passengers had returned to their routines. Laptops open. Wine glasses half full.
Conversations low and controlled.
But every so often, someone glanced at him differently now. Not suspicious. Aware. The new lead attendant approached quietly. Mr. Reed, the captain would like to speak with you privately when convenient. Malcolm nodded. In 10 minutes. She stepped away. His phone buzzed again. Board vote result: interim suspension of senior attendant pending full review. Mandatory bias and protocol retraining for cabin leadership team. Dispatch verification policy to be revised effective immediately. There it was. Not dramatic, not vengeful, structural. Malcolm leaned back, eyes steady on the words. He hadn't asked for termination. He hadn't demanded public humiliation. He had asked for process.
And process had answered.
A follow-up message appeared: recommendation public statement. He typed slowly. No public attack. Internal memo. Emphasize verification before escalation. Dignity as operational standard. Send. Because humiliation doesn't reform culture. Standards do. He looked down the aisle toward the rear cabin. The senior attendant was speaking quietly with the in-flight supervisor, now posture smaller, movements careful. Not destroyed. Confronted. That mattered. Maya passed by again, and this time her shoulders weren't tense. She had chosen integrity before power shifted. That mattered too. The captain approached at last and stopped beside seat 1A. Mr. Reed, he said quietly, we'll be implementing changes immediately. Malcolm met his gaze. Good, he replied. A brief pause. Then he added, voice low but steady, make sure the next person in this seat doesn't need to own the airline to stay in it. The captain nodded once. And in that quiet exchange above the clouds, the decision became more than discipline. It became direction. The plane began its descent just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Orange light stretched across the wings, soft and steady. Inside the cabin, everything looked normal again. Glasses collected.
Seats upright.
Voices low. But normal doesn't mean unchanged. Malcolm Reed closed his laptop and glanced once more at the skyline forming beneath the clouds. The city below glittered indifferent to what had happened 37,000 feet above it. Systems rarely make headlines when they correct themselves. They just adjust. His phone buzzed one final time. Internal memo sent. Policy update effective immediately. He didn't open it. He already knew what it said. Verification before escalation. Documentation before removal. Dignity before assumption. The aircraft touched down smoothly. Applause didn't erupt. It didn't need to. As the plane taxied toward the gate, passengers gathered their belongings with new, quiet awareness. The silver-haired woman paused beside him. You didn't have to say anything, she said softly. Yes, Malcolm replied. I did. Because silence only protects the system that misuses it. The cabin door opened. Passengers filed out in orderly lines. No one rushed. No one argued. Maya stood near the exit now, offering polite farewells. When Malcolm approached, she met his eyes. Thank you, she said, for what he asked, gently, for not letting it slide. He gave a small nod. Just remember, he told her, standards don't enforce themselves. He stepped into the jet bridge alone. No cameras waiting. No press.
Just the steady rhythm of footsteps on metal flooring.
Behind him, operations teams were already drafting training revisions. Dispatch protocols were being rewritten. Review boards were recalibrating escalation thresholds. It wouldn't be announced as reform. It would be labeled operational refinement. But everyone who had been in seat 1A that day would know the truth. The problem had never been about a seat. It had been about assumption, and assumption collapses under documentation. Malcolm walked toward the terminal exit hoodie, still simple stride, still calm. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't flexed his ownership. He hadn't humiliated anyone. He had simply drawn a line where dignity begins. Because power doesn't need to shout to be recognized, and justice doesn't need spectacle to be real. Sometimes it just needs one person willing to stay seated.